Very good to see you. Is this thing on yet? Can you hear me yet? I don't know how to turn this thing on. Who gave me this? Okay. Now we're on. We're having a little trouble with the computer display. I don't usually preach from a computer. Don't usually use the PowerPoint, but I have a lot of quotes that I want to share with you because of the nature of this lesson. First of all, we'll try it and we'll see what happens here. We thank you for being a part of this series of studies. I'm thankful that the Sandyville Church has chosen to ask us to do part of these studies in Islam, because it is very much of a growing religion, and to some people, and maybe rightly so, a growing problem. We don't want to come across this as if we hate anybody, and we don't want to come across as if we are trying to put down anybody. We simply want to understand. I'll tell you what I'm going to have to do is turn off this projector and just go from the computer. I was hoping to show you all the quotes, but I'm just going to have to read them to you, so I hope that's not too boring for you in the end of things. We'll try to get something else worked out for later in the week. Now, let me try this again. There we go. Let's see if it's my, now we'll find out for sure if it's my computer or if it's the projector here. First of all, let me thank you for being a part of this. I'm sorry if I can't remember all your names. I've loved the Sandyville congregation for a long time and have trouble after not being here for a few years remembering everybody's names when we get here. I always tell this little story. It goes something like this. This fellow's at a party with his wife, and they're a little bit older, but he's bragging about this doctor they've been going to. He says to his friend, "Oh, this doctor we've been going to, he's really helping us with our short-term memory. I mean, it's just fantastic. He is really helping us with our short-term memory loss." And his buddy finally challenges him. He says, "Really? What's the name?" He says, "Well, let me see. Long stem, petals, thorns." His buddy suggests, "Rose?" He says, "Yeah, that's it. Hey, Rose, what's the name of our doctor we've been going to?" So that's about how I feel this morning. And I'm trying to remember everybody's name, so I hope you'll be patient with me through the week. Well, I have a lot of ground to cover in a short amount of time. There are a lot of quotes that I want to get to. Here is something from sort of a background of the study of Islam. We just want to sort of overall introduce the subject this morning. Ergun Mehmet Caner and Emir Fethi Caner, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, wrote a book published in 2002 called Unveiling Islam. These two were brothers who eventually became converted to the Christian faith in the broadest sense of the term. They left their Islamic faith, and their father then disowned them. And they went years and years without seeing their father until they saw him finally on his deathbed. And they tried to make some sort of resolution there, but they just couldn't, because he did not give up his Islamic faith and they would not give up their Christian faith, and therefore they were at odds. They wrote this book after the attacks of 9/11 that have spurred interest in Islam around the world more than anything else, I suppose. The opening of their book recounts some of the things that Osama bin Laden, there are different spellings to a lot of these Arabic names, you understand, Osama or Usama. Osama bin Laden said in a December 2001 videotape that was released. A lot of you can remember the 13 years ago that these videotapes came out. You remember the morning and where you were of 9/11, and you remember the months of anthrax attacks that took place after that. You remember, some of you, a world that lived in relative peace before these attacks that's been forever changed by the occurrences of that one day, don't you? Here are some of the things that Osama bin Laden said on that video of December 2011. He said, "Those youth who conducted the operations did not accept any fiqh or jurisprudence." Fiqh is an Arabic word for judicial system, the way justice works. They did not accept any jurisprudence in the popular terms, but they accepted the fiqh or the jurisprudence that the Prophet Muhammad brought. Those young men said in deeds in New York and Washington, speeches that overshadowed all other speeches made everywhere else in the world. The speeches are understood by both Arabs and non-Arabs, even Chinese. In other words, the attacks are understood in every language. People could see on their television things blowing up, but these were understood. It is above all the media said, Osama said. Some of them said that in Holland, at one of the Islamic centers, the number of people who accepted Islam during the days that followed the operations were more than the people who accepted Islam in the last 11 years. In other words, there were these explosions in New York and Washington, and people around the world started flocking to Islam, was his claim. I heard someone, he said, on an Islamic radio who owns a school in America say, "We don't have time to keep up with the demands of those who are asking about Islamic books to learn about Islam." Well, some of that might have been the same reason we want to know. Why were these attacks? Were these just radicals? Is this the core of the religion? What is this? That's what we want to explore this week. He continues to say, Kinnair says, this event made people think about true Islam, which benefited Islam greatly. Well, that was Osama bin Laden. Is this true Islam? The same video has an eerie poem at the end that Osama would quote, and it ends like this: "And over weeping sounds now, we hear the beats of drums and rhythm. They are storming his forts and shouting, 'We will not stop our raids until you free our lands.'" What's the background of some of this? Well, Guy N. Woods, back in 1991, after the first Gulf War, some of you remember that, some of you may have served in it. After the first Gulf War, wrote a little booklet called Biblical Backgrounds of the Troubled Middle East. In that, this Bible scholar traces how we got to the place that we are today. It really does go back to the Bible. I really do believe the book of Genesis to be actual, historically, especially in regard to this particular instance. You see, there was a man named Abraham who was called out of his Mesopotamian home to go to Ur of the Chaldees and then finally to a land of Canaan. God promised Abraham that through his seed all nations of the earth would be blessed. That's a reference to the coming Christ in Genesis chapter 3. Galatians chapter 3 verse 16 points that out. He also promised Abraham that in the intervening time before the Christ that he would protect his people and he would give him a great number of descendants. He would give him a great number of offspring. Well, Abraham, you realize, had trouble believing that God would provide him with a number of offspring at first. He would become a great man of faith. But he had some struggles, if you remember the accounts from Genesis 12 through 22. One of the struggles was that he was old. He was 75 years old when he got the promise. He lived to be a little older than 100, but he was 75 years old, and in those days, just like today, you don't look at 75-year-old men and think of them as being the father of brand new offspring. His wife was 65 at the time. And you usually don't look at 65-year-old women and think of them as being the type of person that can have a child. But God can work wondrous things. So God promised that Abraham, through Sarah, would have a son. And that through that son there'd be a descendancy that would come of nations more than the sand of the sea, more than the stars that are in the sky. These are all prophecies. Some of the scriptures are listed here. Well, eventually those promises came true. Eventually, Israel would receive all the land that they were promised. Joshua chapter 23 verse 14, as well as Joshua 21 verses 43 through 45, indicate that not one word failed of all the good things that God had promised the children of Israel. In other words, he gave them everything. Now it was conditional. They might have to give up that land if they disobeyed God, which would be the case later, but that's another whole series of studies. Along the way, before Abraham and Sarah had Isaac, when Abraham was 100 and Sarah was 90, before that happened, they tried to take matters into their own hands on one occasion. It was common practice, not a good practice, not a Bible-approved practice, not a godly practice, but it was common practice that if a wife could not have a son, that the wife would say, "Here's my handmaid, here's my slave," to her husband, "You go in and have a son with her." Well, it wasn't pleasing to God, but that's what happened. Abraham went into a handmaid named Hagar and had a son named Ishmael. Hagar and Ishmael then were scorned and mocked in Abraham's household by Sarah. But God was going to have mercy upon this family because God can take a bad situation and make it turn out for good. But he had some mercy for this family, but he also predicted something about Ishmael's descendants. Now I realize all the biblical teaching that says that a person is responsible for his own sins and he doesn't inherit anything from his father. He doesn't pass on any sins to his son. I realize that. But yet there's this prediction here. Outside of the realm of free will, God can know what's going to happen. And here's this prediction that what's going to happen with Ishmael's people. The angel of the Lord said to Hagar, "Behold, you are with child, and you shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your affliction. He shall be a wild man. His hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him. And he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren." In other words, he's going to be a fighter. He's always going to fight. These people are always going to be fighting with somebody else. I don't think God's making them do that. He's not predestined them to that. But here's a prediction of what's... Just like God could predict that Judas was going to betray Jesus without making Judas betray Jesus, that's what God is doing. Well then, the Arab people became the descendants of Ishmael. This is just commonly noted throughout history. You can look in any... They claim, that's what they claim of themselves. I'm not being derogatory in the least. They claim that they're the descendants of Abraham and Ishmael. The Jews are the descendants of Abraham and Isaac. And that's why we have trouble in the Middle East. They're fighting over the land in Palestine that God promised to Abraham's descendants. Now, if I might take a little bit of a tangent here, the land of Israel was given back to the Jews in 1948 by a UN accord after World War II. This has set up a lot of problems that have come in our modern world. The Arabs, the Islamists, think that's their land. The Jews think that's their land. And there will ever be fighting as long as the two are on the face of the earth over that sort of thing. And that's why you have people in Iran denying the Holocaust. As recently as yesterday I saw a headline along those lines. And that's why you have people in Iran saying, we're going to destroy the nation of Israel completely. Now then, these tensions have built up in the last 50 or 60 years to where in 1991, Guy N. Woods in this little book made a prediction that's sort of haunting. He didn't claim to be an inspired prophet or anything, but it's sort of a haunting prediction that he made. In 1991, he said, "Well-informed people are not indifferent to matters that the news media keep ever before them and which could very materially affect them in the near future." Well, they materially affected us in the near future. In 1993, there was the first World Trade Center bombing in about February. I remember because my father went into the hospital on the hospital stay that would bring him his passing right after that World Trade Center bombing. And then we have the material effect of 9/11 not long after that. In the book that these fellows wrote, they go back to the Bin Laden video. Bin Laden declared that the bombing was a blow for the fatwa, or a declared jihad, you've heard that name, that had been signed 2 years before as a virtual declaration of war on the West. He spoke of the universal call to jihad and the obligation to fight. In other words, in 1999, there was a declared fatwa from a Muslim authority that said we have got to war against the West because they're helping Israel. And we have. Some of that might have been based on premillennial thought. Some of that might have been based on the idea that Israel still belongs in that land. But we had helped Israel for a long time, and he said there's going to be a war against the West because of this. And I think we find ourselves in the midst of that war now. Likewise, on December 18th, 2001, the Palestinian Authority Chairman Yasser Arafat said he was willing to sacrifice 70 Palestinians, or 70 Muslims, 70 Palestinians, to ensure the death of one Israeli. Arafat's words were these: "We will defend the Holy Land with our blood and with our spirit. We do not only wear uniforms, we are all military. We are all martyrs in paradise." Makes you wonder about the religion a little bit. Guy N. Woods, the author of that book, was also a speaker, and I heard him speak in my youth growing up at the Hillview Terrace Church of Christ. I didn't hear this particular lecture, but a while back one of the elders there was talking about a time that Guy N. Woods stood teaching a class at the Hillview Terrace Church, and he said, "My greatest fear for this country," this would be in the 70s or 80s, he said, "My greatest fear for this country is the number of mosques that are being built." That's an Islamic place of worship around this country. It's growing fast, and it's going to affect us, he said. Well, what we want to understand is how their religion matches up to the gospel of Christ. We want to understand understanding that you know a lot about the gospel of Christ, we'll focus our attention on the religion of Islam this week and make some brief comparisons. But this is going to be an information-giving sort of series of lectures, if you will. I find that it's a current problem. I went with the students at the West Virginia School of Preaching a few weeks ago over to the Northeastern Correctional Facility, the jail, to get us signed up so we could go in on Sundays and perform worship services with the guys there. The chaplain there gave us a list of activities that are going on in the jail. The Wiccans have their time to meet. The Buddhists have their times to meet. But the Muslims get 2 to 3 times a week, sometimes in Arabic. And then if you can put pieces together sometimes without being a conspiracy theorist, you might think about this. If the Muslims are getting 2 or 3 classes a week in our local jails in West Virginia, and if it's true that what the chaplain told me that 90% of that population will circulate back into society at some point, then what do we have? A lot of Muslims in society. Then it concerns us. Are they of the kind of mindset of Osama bin Laden, or are they not? Many people claim that it's a peaceful religion. There are probably many Muslims who are peaceful. But we can't judge a religion based upon what people do. There are lots of people in Christianity, under the banner of Christianity, who do things that are not authorized by Christ. Isn't that correct? Well, there are lots of people in Islam who do things that are not authorized by Islamic teaching. What I want to focus on this week is what is authorized by Islamic teaching, the source of the matter. And then we can decide whether or not it's a religion of peace or religion of violence, and how we as Christians ought to answer it. Here are some basics of Islamic beliefs. Islam means submission. A Muslim is one who is in submission to the divine will. Islam is the youngest of the major world religions. It has about 1 billion people worldwide. That's about 1/7 of the world's population. 48 nations are under strict Islamic rule. And once a nation is taken over by Islamic rule, it hardly ever goes back to anything different. Sharia law is what they call it. Muhammad was born in 570 AD, about 570 years after our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ was born. He was born in the city of Mecca, which is in southwest Saudi Arabia. We'll have a whole lecture on Muhammad tonight, so I'm going to gloss over that information right now. The Islamic religion is monotheistic. That's a good thing. They're not for idols. They were answering the idolatry of the time, because in Saudi Arabia and the Arab world at the time, every tribe worshipped a different god. Muhammad tried to bring unity by uniting people under one God. Well, I believe in one God, but it's not the same God of the Islamists. More about that as we progress. Furthermore, their worldview is not only religious. I think you'll see from quotes of their scholars, not me making it up, but quotes of their scholars, that their religion is also a political movement and a military movement. I make those claims now, but I'll back them up throughout the week. I hope you'll continue to return. They have 2 sources of revelation. First, they call an inspired source the Quran, which is something that Muhammad got over a 23-year period, saying that the angel Gabriel would speak to him on different occasions and give him different surahs or chapters. There are 114 surahs in their Quran that are arranged from longest to shortest, not chronologically. And these came progressively over the time period that Muhammad was alive, from about 600 to 623 AD at the time of his death. And then there is the Hadith. The Hadith is a collection of poems and stories about Muhammad's life. They don't regard these as inspired. They don't say they're inspired, but if you challenge what any of them say, they kind of regard them as inspired. Some of these were given while the Quran was given while Muhammad was supposedly in an ecstatic state. That is, he was shaking, or he was trembling, or he was falling on the ground, or in a trance. And then the Hadith, they claim, were given to him while he was not in a trance-like state. Those are just the claims. I'm not going to evaluate them at this time. They have many points of their faith. The very first point of their faith is, there is no God but God. And if they say that, along with, and Muhammad is his prophet, then somebody has converted from Islam. Now, I just said it, but I didn't mean it as I believing it, so I didn't convert. But if someone says it, means it, they're considered a convert to Islam. They believe that God gave prophets. The Quran mentions 28 prophets that are from all ages, from Adam through Abraham to Moses, on up to Jesus, who was a prophet, but not the last prophet according to them, and then on to Muhammad. They believe that each age was given a book through its prophet. Moses was given the Old Testament. Jesus was given the New Testament. But they believe that these have been corrupted through time. That's their way of explaining when the Quran doesn't agree with the Bible. Well, the Bible's been corrupted, the Quran has not. That is their explanation. And then they say there are good and bad angels. The chief good angel is Gabriel, and the chief fallen angel is Shaitan or Satan. They believe in lots of other things that we'll discuss throughout the week. After Muhammad died in 623 AD, he left a successor. He had his best friend, Abu Bakr, who was the father of Aisha, which was also one of Muhammad's wives as well. Abu Bakr became the first caliph. This would be the religious, political, and military leader after Muhammad. He served for 2 years in that capacity, and then he died, and a friend named Umar succeeded them, who worked as the leader of this religion and political movement for 10 years, till 644 AD. And during that time, Islam expanded into Syria, into Iraq, into Jerusalem, into Egypt, and into parts of Persia. It was expanding out in all directions. There was a time then that somebody got upset with Umar. The Persians had been invaded by them. One Persian slave was really upset by this, so he assassinated Umar in 644 for revenge. After him came a caliph by the name of Uthman from 644 to 656. Uthman had appointed a council of 6 people to choose his successor when he died, and it's a good thing he got it done in time, because after he expanded Islam into North Africa and made an establishment of Persia as a Muslim province, he was murdered by army insurgents. Then the controversy started. The next caliph to be chosen was Ali. And he was a cousin and also a son-in-law of Muhammad. He was married to Muhammad's daughter, Fatima. Many people thought then that he should have the caliphate, and that after him, somebody from his blood family should always be the leader. Those people who believe that somebody from Muhammad's family and then Ali's family should always be the leader are known today as, here's a word you've probably heard, the Shiite Muslims. You've heard that word, I think. And those people who believe that sort of a popular election should take place, or a council of people should choose the next caliph, those are known as the Sunni Muslims. The Sunnis believe that everybody just picks a leader. The Shiites believe that it should be through a bloodline, and that's pretty much the 2 main divisions of Islam still these 1500 years later. Sunnis make up about 86 or 87% of the Islamic world. Shiites make up about 13 or 14% of the Islamic world, and there's a 1% variation in there that has a whole lot of other divisions. Now in Iran, the Shiite population makes up about 93% of Iran's population. And you see then why Iran and Iraq are often at war, because of the Sunni and Shiite things that trace back all the way to the murder of Uthman, the establishment of Ali, and then Ali going out of power, leaving his sons Husayn and Hussein after him, and people fighting about who should be a caliph. Some seceded from Ali's movement over a dispute. They became known as the Kharijis, or seceders, in 661. Then, after Ali died, after Ali was assassinated, his son Hassan became Imam. Imam, that's different from Caliph. Caliph was about here and Imam was up here. They said Imam is better than Caliph because he's more closely an inspired religious leader. So the Shiites claim that Hassan became the first Imam of what was to be 12. He was poisoned in about a month, and then his brother Hussein, Husayn, became the third Imam. Supporters of this stride are strongest in Iran. Hussein was murdered then, and his head cut off and displayed. And this is still mourned every year by the Shiites in a somber parade and celebration where they get angry and get themselves worked up about Hussein's murder all those years ago. Then there were different dynasties that followed. There was the Umayyad dynasty, the Abbasid dynasty, the Fatimid dynasty that would come in ruling Islam throughout the Middle Ages and up until our present time. Sufism is a branch of Islam that is sort of the mystics, like Christians would have monks and mystics. Sufism is the branch of Islam that is that. Wahhabism is kind of like Christians' Puritans. The Sikhs, S-I-K-H-S, often wear turbans, and they're really not pure Islamists. It's sort of a mix of Islam and Hinduism, which is the worship of many gods. Then there are the Twelvers. The Twelvers believe that there will be 12 imams. The 12th imam did not die, but was taken by Allah to heaven and will return to earth at the end to bring peace and justice. Then there are the Seveners, who rest their hopes on the 7th imam instead of the 12th. Now you mock, they're divided. Well, so is Christianity. Christianity is divided too, isn't it? And that's not why we're going to base our claims on what happens, but on what their original source books and their original ideas were. And that's what we want to do in Christianity as well, is get back to the New Testament and supersede all of man's teachings. And then in this country, probably most famously, is the Nation of Islam. About the 1930s it started, and a fellow had convinced African Americans that they were Arab descendants called the Moors, and that they should all become Muslims. And thus you had some of our great sports figures of the 20th century converting to the Nation of Islam. Cassius Clay became Muhammad Ali. You see where he got his names. And Lou Alcindor became Kareem Abdul-Jabbar in this Nation of Islam. Well, the leadership then had contemporary dynasties in different parts of the world. The caliphate eventually would give way to a local king or a sultan. There's so many terms on the Disney movie Aladdin that relate to Islam. The sultan is the king. The royal vizier is a minister to the king, like Jafar was. Jafar is a name that was used throughout all of these leaders. I think there was a dynasty called the Jafari, even at one point. I'm not sure about that. So there are a lot of things there. Now, then the Ottoman Empire came along after the Crusades. You hear a lot about Christianity because of the Crusade, don't you? From 1095 to 1291, the Catholic Church essentially fought back and said, we're going to take Jerusalem back. And they declared a holy war of their own on the Muslims. It wasn't authorized by God. God didn't want that sort of thing, but that's what they did. And the Crusades have left a bad taste in people's lives for a long, long time. Christ's kingdom is a little bit different than Muhammad's kingdom. Well, a lot different. Here's one way. It was prophesied in Daniel chapter 2, verse 44, in the days of these kings, that is in the days of the Roman kings, if you study that prophecy, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. It will not be left to other people. It will break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Let me ask you, who's been reigning on Jesus' throne since Jesus ascended to heaven? Jesus. Nobody's ever going to assassinate him. He's already died. He's already been resurrected. He's never going to die. Nobody's ever going to assassinate him. He's always going to be the head of his church, his spiritual kingdom. Luke chapter 1, verses 32 and 33. Now then, back to Islam. I just have a few minutes left and a whole lot of slides, so I'm going to go fast. There are 6 obligatory duties in Islam. The first is reciting the creed. There is no God but Allah. The second is that you got to pray 5 times a day facing Mecca. You got to find out where you are, where Mecca is in Saudi Arabia, and face that way and bow and do ritual ablutions, washings beforehand. Even, I read one place, cleaning out your nose with water before you do so. Third, you got to give to the poor for the furtherance of Islam. Well, giving to the poor, I'm all in favor of that. But for the furtherance of Islam, I don't think so. And then number 4, you have to fast for 1 month each year. Now their fast is during the month of Ramadan. You've probably heard that on the news. And their fast consists of this. You eat a big buffet breakfast before it turns light. Then you can eat anything you want after dark, just during daylight. Well, even a hungry guy like me can handle that. But that's part of their religious observance. And then, 5thly, they have to make a pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in their lifetime, if they're financially able. There are certain rituals they have to do, like circling the Kaaba 7 times. I'll tell you what that is later. And then the 6th obligatory duty, at least by most scholars, is jihad. There's dispute over whether jihad means a personal inner struggle or whether it means a war against unbelievers. I'll let you decide as we progress through quotes about that sort of thing this week. I believe Tuesday night, that is the focus of our lesson, but things will come up. Traditionally, at the start of jihad, I'll tell you, Christians and Jews would be conquered in their communities. They would be allowed to pay jizya or tax and live under Islamic rule. But pagans would be killed, and they would be wiped out or they'd be told to leave the Arabian Peninsula. That's what it was at the first. Now then, there's a battle on political and religious fronts. Is it real? That's what we want to know. The significant difference, these brothers who left Islam say, the significant difference between Christians and Muslims then is not history, but theology. Orthodox Christians are taught to live at peace by the living and written Word of God. Muslims are taught by the Quran and Allah's Messenger to, here's a quote from Surah 9 verse 5 from the Quran, "Fight and slay the pagans wherever you find them." That's a quote from the original source of Islam. The pact, then, in the 7th century, they made a pact with some of the lands around them, and the Pact of Umar states these 4 or 5 points. 1, you can't build churches, monasteries, convents, or monks' quarters anywhere in the quarters of Islam. And 2, you cannot manifest religion publicly or convert anyone to it. Christians shall not prevent any of their kin from entering Islam, but Christians cannot be converting people from Islam anywhere that Islamic rule is. This is from the 7th century, the 600s, when Islam got its start. Then they shall show respect toward the Muslims and shall rise from seats when Muslims wish to sit. In other words, in the Pact of Umar, if some Muslims would come in here today, you would be obligated to rise and let Muslims sit there. That's Pact of Umar. Now, the Gospel of Christ says you ought to treat them as you want to be treated, but this is for different reasons. And the Pact of Umar said they shall not display crosses or books in the roads or markets of the Muslims. That's from the Pact of Umar in the 7th century. Here's brief history, some historical markers in Islam. In 691, the Dome of the Rock Mosque was erected in Jerusalem. You remember that, don't you? That stands where the Temple of Solomon once stood, or at least Herod's temple that was destroyed in AD 70. In 715, a great mosque was erected in Damascus, Syria. In 732, after about 100 years of complete expansion, the Islamists were conquering everywhere they went, north, south, east, and west. They came to a place in Tours, France, where finally they were stopped. And this is why Islam does not rule Europe today, because in 732, finally their advance was stopped at that place. And then in 1095 to 1291, the Crusades took place. And then in 1453, the Ottoman Empire took over the Byzantine Empire. There was a Byzantine Empire, a Christian empire, so to speak, from Constantinople, what is now Istanbul in Turkey, and the Ottomans started ruling, and their rule went up until after World War I in the 20th century, when tactically they made a mistake by aligning their fates to Germany and lost when Germany lost. Now then, as the Ottoman Empire declined, these brothers say, as the Ottoman Empire declined, Islam faced a worldview unknown to their psyche, one before which they adopted a stance of defense survival. Here's what they're saying. Before about 1918, Islam had been expanding everywhere. But after 1918 and after World War I, they kind of got stopped. And so for a while, and maybe if you want to measure it in different areas, maybe a couple hundred years before that in some areas, but at least after that, Islam kind of got on the defensive and said, well, just keep house, we'll just do it. We won't really try to expand anymore. We won't really try to convert anybody. Meanwhile, they waited for a golden age of supremacy, these brothers say. And what these brothers claim, the ones who left Islam, is they believe that now Islam is in sort of a restoration movement. They're trying to expand once again. They're tired of being on the back burner. They're tired of taking a back seat, and they're trying to reach out and expand their borders of their political, their military, and their religious authority. That's what these brothers from Islam say. I'm sort of summing it up for you. There are others who say that as well. A fellow by the name of Akhtar, who wrote in 1990, he said, Muslims are upset with all this modern world stuff. They need to get busy and start taking over again. And then there's a scholar by the name of Bishai, who in 1968, he was a Harvard professor. In 1968, he wrote a book I'll be referring to throughout this week. The importance of this book is, think about 1968. Who in America thought about Islam? Not too many people. This is outside of the purview of the common controversy of the day. This is outside of the context of what we're going through today. So what he says to me bears some authority. He says this: Muhammad was not only the leader of Islam as a state, but also the leader of Islam as a religion and the leader of Islam as a military movement. That's before 2001, when we started hearing, oh, most of us are peaceful, most of us are wanting a religion of peace. Back in 1968, this Muslim scholar admitted he was religious, he was political, he was military, in all of these three roles as a leader. He commanded a he maintained a standing army along the borders and declared the jihad whenever he deemed that such an action was necessary for the security of the Islamic State. Well, with the notable exception of the Muslims, say these brothers Kaner, with the notable exception of the Crusades, the Muslims have initiated almost all wars in their history. Except for when the Catholic Church decided to fight back, they've initiated all wars in which they've ever been involved. War is not a sidebar of history for Islam, they say. It is the main vehicle for religious expansion. It is the Muslim duty to bring world peace via the sword. Conservative Muslims see Western culture as destructive to Islamic traditions and beliefs. While modern people are familiar only with the defensive Islam of the last 300 years, the religion has never forgotten the previous 1,000 years of conquest in the cause of Allah. It is this traditional conquering Islam that has reemerged. That's what these brothers who left the faith are saying. Now that's different. We had one student at West Virginia School of Preaching who came to me the other day and learned I was studying Islam. And he said, let me tell you what I learned about Islam in high school. He didn't know what I was studying. He didn't know the conclusions I'd come to. He said, we were told that Muhammad came to bring peace to tribes that were fighting between Mecca and Medina. That's what we were taught in high school. Muhammad came to bring peace to these faction tribes. And I said, I knew our school system was lying to us in a lot of areas, but I didn't know it was lying that bad. It's just a bold-faced lie. That's all there is to it. He didn't come to bring peace. He came to fight. I suppose if you want to say he brought peace after fighting by unifying people, you might get away with that. But he didn't come with an effort to bring peace in that regard. Well, I have a lot. Well, no, this is the last two slides, actually. Give me one more minute, please. In their book, The Blood Cries Out, Paul Marshall describes the devastation in the Nuba Mountains regions of South Central Sudan. Mass graves hold, this is today, this is, well, 2002 or so. Mass graves hold the remains of entire villages. In internment camps where women and children are kept, Nuba women are systematically raped by Arab soldiers just so they'll have non-Nuba offspring, just so they'll have mixed breeds. Some report that Christians have been crucified by soldiers, and Sudan is not an isolated case. I'm going to depart from the quote and go to there to some things I know. I know of a lady who came from Morocco, and if she ever went back there as a Christian, she would be killed, she says. And I know of some things that are going on in the news today. I saw a report the other day that in Kenya, some jihadists raided a Christian village at night while they were sleeping, put their houses on fire, and shot anybody who attempted to escape the fire. About 150 professing Christians were killed. At least that's the report. I don't know because I wasn't there. But this is the religion that we're studying this week, and I will try to bring all sorts of sources and all sorts of quotes to you so that you can decide for yourselves and you can see how it compares to the religion of Christ. Well, I thank you for your time this morning.